Jo O'Neal has been with the Charleston County Coroner's Office for over 20 years and presently serves as the Chief Deputy Coroner. But in November, she hopes to become the Charleston County Coroner. I speak exclusively to Bobbi Jo for this edition of Quintin's Close-Ups. And if you haven't already, subscribe to my YouTube channel and like Quintin's Close-Ups on Facebook.
Bobbi Jo O'Neal, welcome to Quintin's Close-Ups.
Thank you for having me. It's good to be here, Quintin.
Oh, I appreciate it greatly. Obviously, you are the Chief Deputy Coroner for Charleston County. Who is Bobbi Jo O'Neal these days?
Well, as you know, I've been the Chief Deputy Coroner for Charleston County for 20 years. You know, I've been serving the residents of Charleston County in the coroner's office and serving them really during their most tragic days. Just so everyone knows my background, I'm a registered nurse, have been for about 25 years. Prior to coming to the coroner's office, I was actually an emergency room nurse, and I worked at Charleston Memorial Hospital, which was, you know, back in the day was the county hospital. Everyone who's, you know, been in Charleston for any length of time knows the county facility. It's no longer there. But I was an ER nurse there, and that's where I first got started with forensics. We would take care of trauma patients and victims of crime who would come into the emergency room, and we would care for them and document their injuries. And then I recognized at that time that there wasn't any care for sexual assault victims. And so I became a sexual assault nurse and would care for victims there at the Medical University, coordinated their team, and took care of those victims, learning how to document their injuries, gather forensic evidence, and then just care for them as they needed to be cared for. And so since that time, when I was there, I met the current coroner at the time, who was Susan Schuning, and also the Chief Deputy Coroner at the time, which was Ray Wooten, and got to know them. And they actually asked me to come and join their investigative team back in 1998. So since then, I've had the opportunity and the responsibility of investigating thousands of deaths that have occurred in Charleston County, whether those were individuals who died in the privacy of their own home, or whether they were individuals who died in more tragic circumstances, whether that's a car accident or a self-inflicted injury or work-related injury, gun violence, drug overdoses, all the way up to the incidences that have happened here in Charleston County that have made international news, to include the Charleston Sofa Superstore fire, the incident with Mr. Walter Scott, and then the massacre at the Mother Emanuel Church. And all the while, our responsibility and who I am today, then and who I am today, is that we are their voice. We make sure that that person who died and the extension their family are cared for, that we maintain their dignity, that we provide a full death investigation to make sure that we answer all the questions surrounding that. We are the legal statutory authority to do that. And so we continue to do that today and have expanded our services and expanded our forensic capabilities. And I look forward just to continue to serve the public in that manner.
Obviously, you are running for Charleston County Coroner against Herbert Fielding, whom I interviewed together with Frank Rocklow, his former rival, last week. And I'm wondering this, Bobbi Jo, how will your voice be as a Charleston County Coroner? Well, I think
first of all, everybody needs to know what the coroner does. So let me go back a little bit, because I think there's confusion about our role. Sure. And so the coroner is a constitutional office. So what that means is our South Carolina Constitution mandates that there is a coroner who is elected in each county to represent the citizens, represent the people, to make sure that deaths are investigated properly. They are the legal statutory authority. They're the lead death investigator in the county, and that is the responsibility of the coroner. And so what do we investigate? So, you know, I think there's this sort of misunderstanding on what we do. And so the coroner is responsible for investigating every death that occurs outside of a hospital, first and foremost. So that can include someone dying in their own home, a hotel, on the roadways, in a boating accident. It could be a job-related incident. We have deaths that even occur on container ships and cruise ships that dock here in Charleston. Those are the responsibilities of the Charleston County Coroner's Office. In addition to that, we're responsible for investigating every death that occurs inside of a hospital where they've been there less than 24 hours. So if someone comes in through an emergency room, The coroner's office is going to be notified, and we conduct a full investigation to make sure that we understand how and why that person died. We're also responsible if the person dies in the hospital and they've been there more than 24 hours,
Right.
but their death is related to something not natural. So, for example, if someone was in a car accident and they are admitted to the hospital and their condition deteriorates and they die a few days later, that is still reportable and investigated by the coroner's office. One other responsibility we have that's investigative, I also don't think the public recognizes, is we authorize cremations in Charleston County. So before a family can have their loved one cremated, if that's the method of disposition they're choosing, the funeral home has to get a permit from the coroner's office. And that request is evaluated by an investigator to make sure that we do not investigate a death prior to that happening, because once that cremation happens, we can't go back and investigate. And that is another investigative responsibility of the coroner's office. And many people don't recognize that. And so that's one reason that we are a very, very, very busy office. Charleston's growing.
Right.
Population is expanding. Our numbers of deaths are increasing. And so we need to have qualified individuals who are experienced, who know how to investigate, because that, again, is the statutory requirement of the office.
Now, let me go back to the actual interview that I did with Herbert Fielding and Frank Brocklow last week. And in that interview, they basically said, hey, listen, Frank says, I share a very common vision with Mr. Fielding. Let me ask you this, Bobbi Jo O'Neal. Let me ask you this. What vision will you have if you become the Charleston County Coroner?
Well, there's a number of things, but first and foremost, the Office of the Coroner is responsible for investigating deaths. So, to have a candidate for this office be interviewed on your show and admit that they're not going to be responsible for the main statutory requirement that's occurring in the office should be concerning to anyone who's listening. So the main requirement is investigating deaths and representing a decedent. Now, on top of that, what are we responsible for and what do we participate in? So we participate in community programs based on statistics that are local. So there are local statistics that we are mandated to report. So whether that's toxicology, drug levels in victims of traffic fatality victims, that's mandatory reporting for us. We also report anything where there is an officer-involved incident. That's a mandatory report. We report all types of violent death reporting. And then based on that, we develop community programs and work with our community to help preventative issues as we can. But that isn't the statutory requirement for the office. It is investigating. And in order to have good statistics, in order to be able to develop a very good prevention program, you first have to understand what happened. And that's from a really great investigation from board-certified medical legal death investigators who are qualified and experienced to do that job.
Now, how do you hope to expand on that if you become coroner?
The community service?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, well, let me just tell you what we've been doing over the years. I think there's sort of a statement that we're not doing anything, which is very far from the truth. And I'll give a couple of examples. So a number of years ago, we recognized through our investigations of the deaths of infants and babies in Charleston County that we were noticing that in a lot of those situations, the babies were being placed face down on their tummies to sleep. And so as we investigated those deaths, we started documenting them properly and asking the right questions and then reporting that correctly on death certificates and in databases of which we're a part of. And out of that came the National Back to Sleep campaign. So many people will remember there was a big movement about placing your babies on their backs to sleep. That came out of a really strong medical legal death investigation. That's where that started. And so after that, we started some programs in Charleston County where we started to go where mommies and daddies were that were expecting. We would go to baby fairs and we would set up a crib actually at the baby fair and talk to mommies and daddies who are expecting a new baby and say, let me tell you about the risk factors that we're seeing here so that you don't meet me while I'm working. And we still do that today. We're very involved with Chief Burgess at the North Charleston Police Department. They have a program called The Baby Changes Everything. And every time they do that, we go and speak to the community regarding the risk factors we see. So that's one aspect. Another current trend right now is obviously the opioid epidemic and our involvement with prevention there. Again, there's sort of twofold in what we're doing currently. And that's one, again, with a strong investigation, we are able to get information from their families and from their medical record and from the investigation itself as to what maybe went wrong. Did that person fall through the cracks? Did they not have Narcan available to them, to their family or their friends? Was there not resources for funding to get them into a treatment program? And we provide that information back to those agencies who prevention is what they do, that they are the experts in that. The other side of that is really from a law enforcement perspective, and where did those drugs come from? And working with DEA and narcotics teams, that when we test a blood sample and it comes back with a certain kind of drug or chemical in it, that we're sharing that information with them so that they can help figure out where that's coming from. So those are just two examples that we are involved in currently, but we've had so many over the years. Another one is Prom Promise. That is a drunk driving initiative for our teens. And that, on prom night, it's one of the best nights of their lives, and we want them to go home afterwards and sort of talking to them about the dangers of drunk driving. So we've been involved in so many and want to continue. There's obviously so many programs we could do, but we have to go back to what the priority and the statutory requirement is for the office. And that's first and foremost representing the decedent and getting a full investigation to properly document the circumstances surrounding their death. Without that, all those other programs are going to be ineffective because they don't have good data.
Now, in that interview, they basically said, hey, the Charleston County Coroner's Office allegedly is not involved at all as far as being approachable. How approachable is this office in your mind?
I would say we're very approachable. The coroner's office is one of those offices that most people hope they never have to interact with. If you're interacting with the coroner's office, it's because there's been a tragedy that's happened in your family. And so we're one of those offices that people don't really want to think about too much. The other thing about not being approachable, I think maybe that what they may be referring to is information out of the office. Well, I would say that as a coroner, I'm an advocate for the person who died, and I want to protect them. I'm protecting their dignity. I'm protecting their personal information.
Right.
And I can tell you that when all the families I've worked with, all of the years, 20 years, I haven't had one family that's asked me to talk more about their loved one and tell the personal stuff that happened. They want us to keep that as confidential as we can. There is some information we have to share, and we do that readily. Right. And then again, we're very approachable. We speak at schools all the time. We have interns in our office from all sorts of colleges where we help them train if they're interested in forensic sciences. And so we're very approachable to those who have an interest in what we do and have a reason to interact with us because they've lost somebody.
And I know in that interview, Mr. Healing basically wants to make the coroner's office more inclusive in the community. How do you hope to do that in 2021?
Well, I think a couple of things. I mean, one, we're very inclusive if you're in the community. If you're talking about who our employees are, which I think may be what he's referring to, I think we very much reflect the community. I mean, our office is extremely diverse. We have Caucasians, African Americans, Hispanics are in the office. We have a lot of women. We have men. We have veterans. We have representatives from the LGBT community. We've also it's been described that we don't have a variety of investigators, which is also not true. Our investigators come from a variety of backgrounds. They come from nursing, such as myself. There's a few of us. There's also a few of us that are law enforcement officers that moved from law enforcement to our office. We have a few that have a criminal justice and forensic science background, one from EMS, one that came from the chaplaincy. Our individuals come from a diverse background. And then we're also diverse within geography in the county. They're as far north as Awendaw, as far south as Edisto, all over Mount Pleasant, Johns Island, James Island, North Charleston. We represent the community as a whole. And I think the other way to be inclusive is, again, bringing in our local students who want to intern. We brought in Girl Scout troops. We have a College of Charleston student getting ready to join us this fall for an internship. And that's where we take our young folks and we mentor them. And, I like to give a great example. We have a young gentleman in our office, And I met him as I spoke to his college class at Charleston Southern University. Yeah. And he approached his professor and wanted to know if he could intern in the office. And he and I met and got to know one another. He interned for a full semester. And now he is the director of our autopsy services. He's a young 20 African-American male who is doing a fantastic job in our office. And that's how we improve services. That's how we work within the community. We seek qualified, experienced individuals who we can train and mentor and see them become great specialists in their field.
Now, you talk about the community. Obviously, drug abuse is a major issue in this town. What are the new problems and what are the new trends right now in Charleston County?
Yeah, well, I'll say we have kind of an interesting issue that's happening, and that is that we have an opioid epidemic and the COVID pandemic. And those two things are coming together. They are merging and sort of creating a massive storm, if you will. And so because of that, first of all, let me say regarding COVID deaths, most of the COVID deaths aren't reported to the coroner's office. Most of those individuals that are dying of COVID are dying in a hospital setting, and they've been there more than 24 hours. So it's not reportable to us. But what we are seeing is an increase in the drug overdoses. And that's really increased during this COVID pandemic, I think partly because individuals are stressed out. The resources aren't available because things were closed, and they've lost jobs. And so we've got an increase in drug usage. The other thing we've seen during this pandemic is an increase in suicides. And again, businesses have been closed. Some have lost jobs. That's been a problem. And then one other issue we're noticing with COVID that kind of comes with this opioid and COVID combination is that we have a number of individuals who have comorbidities. I mean, they're sick individuals who have health problems, but they're afraid to go to the hospital. They're afraid to go to the doctor's office. And so what's happening is they're staying home and they're getting worse. And because they're afraid of COVID-19 and getting infected, they're not seeking the medical care that they need. And so they are dying at home. So they're not a COVID death. They're not positive with COVID-19, but there is a correlation between not seeking medical attention because of the fear of going to seek medical attention. So just to kind of explain to you sort of what we're seeing locally here. As far as back to the drugs, we are seeing an increase in the opioid usage. Yesterday was Opioid Awareness Day, and there was a celebration, or the 31st, excuse me, that was here in Charleston. We're seeing the problem with prescription drugs, but also with synthetic drugs that are being marketed and shipped into the area. So we see both. So sometimes it's a prescription writing problem where individuals are getting lots of prescriptions. Sometimes it's other drugs that are actually coming into the area, and that's where we work with our DEA to try to figure out where that's coming from and stop it from coming into our community.
Now, the opioid deaths are still high, as you mentioned, even during the health outbreak. What were the numbers in June and July here in Charleston County?
Well, I looked up right before we came on. So far for this year, we have 101 confirmed drug overdoses, but we have 42 that are pending. And so toxicology tests take about 4 to 6 weeks to get back. We send them off to a special forensic lab. That's why. So our numbers last year, we only had 115 for the entire year. So right now we're at 101 confirmed with 42 pending. Those are 42 that we suspected, meaning that we are way past 2019 numbers and we're only in September. So that should give you sort of an indication of where we're headed.
Now, I talked earlier with Herbert and obviously Frank about the crime scene and how you all deal with that. How do you, as a deputy chief coroner, approach a crime scene when there are multiple victims?
Well, unfortunately, I've got experience doing that. I think it's important for everybody to recognize, they think there was an explanation of the coroner owning the body and the law enforcement owning the scene. And that's really not the correct description. We work very closely with law enforcement to investigate a full scene that's going on, whatever that circumstance is. Now, we do handle the body, and we're the ones who determine whether an autopsy is needed or not. And there are national standards about that. I believe my opponent said there are no national standards that affect this office. He is highly mistaken. There are lots of national standards. There are also laws regarding it on how we handle evidence, whether we autopsy or we don't autopsy, who's qualified to do certain aspects of an investigation. So there are national standards, and that's why our office is nationally accredited. Back to your question, how do we approach that? First of all, it's about getting an overall understanding of what those circumstances are, and working with our local law enforcement, and figuring out the proper way to document what has happened there, whether photographically and diagrams. How do we effectively assess and evaluate the body that's present? Because there's a lot of things that the body tells us that we can see without moving them. We can learn about time and how long somebody has been deceased. We can learn about positioning. We can see injuries and which way an injury may have come from, which can tell us which direction a perpetrator might have come from. There's a lot of forensic science involved in that. But then we would work out a way to, in a dignified manner, remove those individuals from there and then take them to our autopsy facility where we can look at those injuries that they may have closer. Every situation is different. Multiple fatalities could be a traffic accident. We've had many traffic accidents where we've had more than one individual, whether they were in the same car or they were in multiple vehicles. We've had multiple incidences where we've had multiple shooting victims that were all in one location. The Mother Emanuel Church is an example that everyone knows. Right. We've had multiple victims in fire situations, whether it's a house fire or the Sofa Superstore. And so there is a process for handling that. There is a whole plan on mass fatality planning. There are national standards about mass fatality planning, and the Charleston County Coroner's Office, we're a part of the emergency management team that helps make those plans. So I'm not sure if I quite answered your question, but there is a lot that goes into it. There's a lot of science, and there's also a lot of care, because we want to properly do our job as the coroner, which is speaking for the decedent. But we also don't want to interrupt any evidence that also law enforcement may be trying to obtain as well. And that's why we have a great close working relationship together. We've worked together for 20 years, and we have a great relationship with all of our agencies.
Now, how will you improve the quality of forensic services for Charleston County?
Yeah, well, I think the answer to that question is understanding what's happening nationally, where the problems are. And so right now, the biggest issue that's happening across the country is a national shortage of forensic pathologists. And so forensic pathologists are those doctors who do the autopsy. So that is a specialty, and there is a huge shortage across the country. And so what's happening, not just in Charleston County, but everywhere, is that because there's that shortage, it's taking longer and longer to get a forensic autopsy complete. So if we have a delay in getting those autopsies done, then that decreases our quality, because investigations are better when they're timely. That includes the autopsy. So how do we fix that? The good thing is that because Charleston County, Coroner Wooten and myself are so involved at the national level and sort of see the trends coming, is that we were aware of this problem coming down the road. And so I actually wrote a federal grant a couple of years ago, and they funded us to completely build out a state-of-the-art forensic autopsy suite in the Charleston County Coroner's Office. So what we did in essence is where we were prior to that, all of our decedents who needed to be autopsied went to the medical university, which is one of our locations that we contract with. But the delays were getting longer and longer and longer because everyone around the state is using the medical university. Right. So those delays are getting longer. So when we were visionary and built out our own facility, and then our a nationally accredited office, what happens is we draw forensic pathologists to us. And so we have a board certified forensic pathologist who now is working with us in our office. And so Charleston County cases can be pleaded in our own office without a delay. We still have some that are at the medical university. That's just how it's going to be for a little while. Yeah. So to improve quality of services is we've got to continue to be ahead of this problem. We need to have more forensic pathologists who want to come to Charleston and work with the Charleston County Coroner's Office. And I can tell you we're talking to a number of them. Charleston's a lovely place. People want to move here. And so that would be the way to improve quality right now, is to make sure that forensic autopsy services are timely and completed by a board certified forensic pathologist. And so that's what we need to keep working on.
You talk about money. I know, obviously, in that interview, Herbert basically says, "Hey, this office has high expenditures, allegedly." What were the expenditures in 2018?
Well, our budget has hovered right around 2 million, we were right under 2 million, I think, in 2018, and I think we went right over that the next year. I think you have to keep in mind the number of deaths that we investigate a year. So in 2019, we investigated over 4,000 deaths. So in 2020, right now, we're at almost 2,900, and we are just at the beginning of September. So when you think about 4,000 deaths, so if we have 10 investigators, and that's where, with any organization, most of your budget is in personnel. If we have just 10 investigators, that does not include our support staff. That means that each investigator is handling over 400 cases apiece. I can tell you what the national standard is. For forensic pathologists, that standard is 250 autopsies. And even in the world of law enforcement, it's recommended that detectives do not handle more than 250 cases a year. So we are at over 400 cases per investigator. So as our numbers continue to rise, because people are moving to Charleston, the budget's going to continue to slowly increase, because that's what it takes to meet the needs of the community, whether that's paying for forensic autopsy services or toxicology services. There is a lot that happens amongst that in the forensic world, whether we're doing DNA samples. Sometimes we have to do DNA testing. We may be comparing dental x-rays, and we need to have a forensic odontologist, which is the forensic dentist, who does that for us.
Right.
So I've heard that we're bleeding money. We are not bleeding money at all. We are on a very tight budget. I think the other thing for everyone to understand is that the coroner doesn't control the budget. Right. That's controlled by county council. And so what happens is that the coroner's office submits to county council a proposal and shows where there are issues and where we're heading. What's the future trends? Is the population increasing? Are we going to need to expand in personnel in order to take care of that? And therefore the budget gets raised slightly to meet those needs. So that's not even controlled by the coroner's office. That's controlled by county council. I would say from an administrative standpoint, one thing that I've really done over the past 10 years is I started writing federal grants for our office. And to this date, I've brought in just under $1 million in federal funds that were not money that Charleston County residents had to fork out through the Charleston County budget. And with those funds, we have completely changed the operation of the office, meaning that's how we built out the forensic autopsy suite. That's how we built out a state-of-the-art forensic evidence room. Our records room has been built out so that, according to the state statutes, we have to keep our records. We have records going back to 1928, the 1920s, and we are the keeper of the record according to the state statute. And so we have to be able to meet all of those requirements. And so I've been fortunate that I've sort of figured out how to write grants to bring that money home back to our Charleston County and improve our services there. I want to, mention something about evidence. I think I've heard my opponent say that there's no reason for us to be handling evidence. Again, that's sort of an interesting concept, because we have a lot of evidence in the coroner's office that we're responsible for. We keep biological samples. We keep toxicology samples. We have DNA samples. We have a lot of samples that are kept in the coroner's office and coroner's offices around the country. So it's not unique to us. And there are laws about how we have to preserve it, how we have to maintain it, and how we have to keep it. There's a Preservation of Evidence of Act law, and that dictates how we do things. And so it's not just because we think it's a great idea, or because we're interested in just handling evidence. The law requires that we maintain that in such a fashion. And so we are meeting the state laws, the federal laws, and then again, the national standards on how we practice within the Charleston County Coroner's Office.
Now, the population, how has that increased in the past year in your mind?
Well, I think, as everybody knows, everyone's moving here. And so we're seeing just huge population increase. But I would also say it's not just about those people who move here, because we don't just serve the citizens who live here. We serve everyone who comes to Charleston. So on any given day, the population in Charleston County doubles because people are coming in for work. They're coming into the medical university. They're coming into Boeing. And we do have deaths that occur at locations where large people comes. Charleston County is also one of the #1 tourist destinations in the world. And so we have travelers who come not only domestically, but internationally, whether they are driving, they are flying, they're coming on cruise ships. And unfortunately, sometimes things happen here. They either have a medical incident, they're involved in a car accident, and the coroner's office not only has to handle and investigate their death, but we also help to get them home. And so that may be working with international consulates to get someone who died here in Charleston back to their home across the ocean, wherever that may be. There are laws regarding that, how death certificates have to be processed. And so we have a great hand in that as well. So our population is about not only the influx moving here, but the surrounding areas and those individuals who come to Charleston County during the day or for a major event, the bridge run, PGA golf tournaments, we could name them, right? Spoleto, that draws in hundreds of thousands of individuals. And should there be a tragedy involving any of those, that's the responsibility of the coroner's office.
Now, Bobbi Jo, I know you mentioned obviously about the budget, and obviously if you need to have the ability to increase personnel, do you need to do that right now?
I think right now we're in a really great place. So we have currently in the office, we have 16 full-time permanent positions that are filled. We have one individual who's actually on a federal grant, and then we have one position that's not filled right now. So the major issue probably coming up for this next year is the individual that's in the grant is really a position that we really need to maintain. That's a person who's in our autopsy room, and we just already talked about the fact that we have a backlog because of a lack of forensic pathologists. So we need to keep that individual. So I have written a grant extension, hoping that we get another year worth of funding to fund that person going into 2021. Should we not get that funding for some reason, then we will need to seek county council approval that we keep that individual. And again, that's going to go back to making sure that our quality of forensic services are where they need to be, because we really need that individual in the autopsy room.
I don't know if you have the answer to this, because obviously we just talked about obviously the COVID-19 deaths, and most of them happening in the hospitals.
Yeah.
Do you have an actual statistic about that so far from March until now?
I would say that I do not have a good statistics for that. And part of that, I know DHEC is tracking that. Again, those deaths aren't reportable to the Charleston County Coroner's Office, so we don't get a report daily on the deaths that occur in Charleston County. So I don't have a good number for that. I think we often get a question about death certificates and COVID-19 and what gets categorized as a COVID death. And I know in the coroner's office, we look at those really closely, the ones that do get reported to us. And is the death really related to COVID? Or there's a difference between someone who dies of COVID and someone who dies with COVID. Those are two very, very different things. And so you can have an individual who was killed in a car accident who happens to be COVID positive. And I think it would be difficult for us to say that they died because of COVID. They were in a car accident. So there is a difference. And so part of our responsibility is sort of sorting that out and figuring out, is COVID the primary responsibility or cause of that person's death, or do they just die with it and not necessarily of it?
And let me get back to politics. Obviously, in the interview, Mr. Fielding said that he says the reason why you filed the lawsuit is because he has an excellent chance of defeating you. He says he has name recognition and experience. Talk to me more about that, and how do you hope to defeat him?
Well, let me talk about the lawsuit. I'm glad to have a conversation about that. Our South Carolina legislature recognized a number of years ago that the coroner's office is a specialty office, and it requires certain amount of qualifications and experience to operate effectively in that office. And my opponent doesn't meet any of those qualifications. Being a funeral director is not one of them that is listed on that affidavit. And on the date of his filing, he did not meet any requirements. And so one thing for, I think, your viewers to understand about me is I've been involved in this profession for over 20 years. I'm the current president-elect of the International Association of Coroners and Medical Examiners. I've been fighting for many years to improve quality and service and increase the professionalism of this industry for a very long time. And that includes improving standards and requirements. And so when my opponent filed and he doesn't meet any of the qualifications and didn't have the experience, that is a complete disservice to the community of which we serve. Because even our state legislature recognizes this experience and qualifications are required for this position. I've heard that argument that I only did that because Charleston County has become more of a Democrat state, or I mean county, excuse me. I would wonder, is that the only reason he filed? Because it's about serving the public. It's about quality. It's about experience and knowing how to take care of people in their most tragic moments. It would have been hypocritical for me not have done something, because I've been fighting for this community for 20 years. I've been fighting for this profession my whole career. And I know what it takes to run the office. I have the administrative skills, as we discussed, with bringing in funds and managing and training and mentoring practically every employee that's in the office. And then also the death investigation skills and being able to be the lead individual in the office, that no matter what happens in Charleston County, there's one person who is responsible, who has the legal authority to make decisions, and that is the coroner, not the individuals underneath the coroner. It's the coroner. And so that person has got to have the right requirements.
And I know earlier this summer the lawsuit was filed, and obviously the lawsuit was dismissed by a local judge. And obviously the newspaper wrote that you allegedly accused both the county and the state department, the Democratic parties, that is, of improperly certifying Mr. Herbert Fielding. How exactly did they certify him?
Well, I mean, the fact is he didn't meet the statutory requirements. The public can go on the Charleston County Election Commission's website and look at his affidavit. The fact is, which came out through the testimony, is that the president of the Charleston County Democratic Party filled in his affidavit after he had signed it and when he was not present. The fact is that Mr. Fielding, he did not sign up for the right program until after I made notice to him that he was not meeting qualifications. So I'm not certain how he can stay on the ballot, but that's not my decision. I have to respect the decision that was made, but I think it's important for everyone to have an understanding about what's needed for this office. I would question that if we have an individual who is unable to fill out his affidavit properly when filing for election, how are they properly going to handle chain of custody of forensic evidence that can dictate whether someone is charged for a crime or not? How can they, without being able to administer that affidavit appropriately and fill it in correctly, is then going to make sure that they properly identify a decedent and make sure that the DNA is processed correctly, that the fingerprints come back correctly? There's some detail here that's very important for the citizens to recognize. And I'm also want everyone to know, since this is not a political position, unfortunately it's elected because it's to represent the people. I mean, that's why it's elected, and I agree it should be elected. It shouldn't be partisan, because that's not how we operate. It's not a partisan position. I know their argument is to flip the seat. If that's the only interest, is to flip the seat, then what a disservice to our community. Because families are at stake here. That when someone dies, and I would ask everyone to sort of think to themselves, because maybe they've not interacted with the coroner's office, that if they have a tragedy in their family and that the coroner has to get involved, you want to make sure that you have someone who has expertise in what they're doing and can speak for their loved one and answer all of the questions that they may have. And that is not a political position. My opponent is interested in a political position. On your own show, he said he's going to be the administrator, and he's passing off the statutory authority to investigate to someone else who also has no experience investigating one death. So I would say that for me, this isn't a political position. I've been serving this community for 20 years. I love what I do, and I love representing individuals and making sure that we speak for them. We give them their voice back. They tell us what happens, and we share that story. And that is something that for a family who's lost someone, that is so important. And that's important for people to think about, that it may not be you, it may not be your family, it may be your neighbor, it may be your coworker. We could have another national tragedy here in Charleston County, and we need to know what we're doing. We need to be able to represent the community and the people well. And so for me, it's not a political position.
And unfortunately, my Bluetooth is telling me to charge. This would never happen. But let me ask you this.
Yeah.
Being that obviously you're chief deputy coroner, has that changed your view on your own mortality?
You know, I think what it does is it makes you value life, because at any moment that can change. And to have an understanding that, you know, maybe maybe death isn't necessarily the worst thing in some circumstances, but it does definitely make you, respect where you are, to appreciate the day. I've seen so many cases in families where they didn't get to say goodbye, whether that was something tragic. And so you start to really appreciate that. And I think from a coroner's perspective is, we can't fix the situation, but we don't want to make it worse. And so that's why we want to care for them.
Oh, and thank you so much for your time, Bobbi Jo O'Neal. And I really do appreciate you, and hope to have you back on Quintin's Close-Ups.
You bet. I'll come back anytime.
And hopefully I'll have the Bluetooth more charged.
If anyone needs to reach me, they can reach me at o'nealforcoroner.com. Find me on Facebook. Send me a message. I'll be glad to answer your question. I'm not afraid of any questions, so feel free. Thank you so much.
You're very welcome anytime.